Hey, this is Tim from Tim and Fran versus the Man. I'm Tim.
I'm Fran. I think you just double introduced yourself.
I do that every time. Uh,
Fuck.
anyway, double introductions aside, what we want to talk to you about, or what we wanted to talk to you about today, is basically my opinion is that it seems like the United States is. It really seems like they are attempting to go to war with Russia. It seems like they're attempting or purposely attempting to put themselves in the conflict. Um, there was a presser recently from Jack Sullivan, and he was basically saying that Putin had not uh, definitively decided whether he was going to invade Ukraine yet. However, a lot of other channels or information channels are suggesting that Putin has already kind of made that decision.
Mhm.
So the United States, or in the presser, he was talking about sending more troops to aid NATO, or U.S. troops to aid NATO in a defensive posture, essentially to get Putin not to invade Ukraine. But the problem is, if Putin's already kind of dead set on that, the United States adding more troops to NATO's forces is essentially that's basically just us getting involved in the conflict.
Right. And yeah, this is basically the context of this is the continued, I guess you could say, crisis now. A lot of it manufactured. A lot of it very one-sided. NATO and the United States putting a lot of pressure on Russia, and Russia generally expanding troops within its borders and territorial waters around Ukraine. There's just been a lot of conflicting reports. This feels like WMDs again. This feels like every other State Department lie that's been, So PBS apparently published an article stating that invasion was imminent. It was totally confirmed. Putin and all of, Russian assets were actually going to go ahead with an invasion of Ukraine. And then our State Department, which, PBS is state funded too, said pretty much the exact opposite. And then France recently, actually, the President Macron there, he also, or is it Prime Minister? Whatever. Talking about geopolitics, don't even know the titles. It's great. But anyway, his phone call
Who
with,
cares? Macron sucks.
yeah, they all suck. But anyway, his conversation with Putin indicated that Putin was not ready to invade. Um, and Biden's conversation with Putin was, very direct. It was, I can actually quote it here. It's literally the same thing that's been said for months, or like any time Ukraine's ever been brought up ever in the context of Russia. He said that an invasion of Ukraine will result in swift and severe costs on Russia. So like nothing new there. Phone call lasted an hour. Apparently, it was quote professional, but oh, he's being real tough. It's like, dude, when have we had a sitting U.S. president not be quote unquote tough on Russia when it came to Ukraine? So there's a part of me that thinks that you're right and an invasion is imminent, and they're just trying to do some kind of weird like psyop with one side denying and the other side, um, you
Mm-hmm.
know, actively putting upwards of 6,000 troops in Ukraine, or at least in
Mm-hmm.
Poland and the surrounding areas. And the other part of me sees like the genuine like fear of that comes from Russia, of all of the terrible things that would be involved in an invasion, namely like the guerrilla forces that would arise in Ukraine, and then Russia right now isn't doing too well, and so it's not like Russia in the past took over like strategic parts of Ukraine and would be in a really good position to take it over entirely. It took over Crimea, which is like the southern little pipsqueak, semi-island part of Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
and didn't really take it over. It was more of a referendum. And I'm not defending the Russians or the United States here. It's just, you know, I personally, I think it's going to be something in between. I think we're probably going to see an advanced hybrid war, with sort of this continual threat of invasion around Ukraine. I could totally be wrong as well, but an invasion, like that's, I don't know. It's a difficult prospect to, I guess, swallow. Like it would be really difficult for the Russians. They would incur a lot of losses. It wouldn't be an overnight, swift invasion of Ukraine, set and done. It would be a relatively not so battle hardened military versus the Ukrainians, which have been in a state of low level war since 2014. So they would actually have a pretty significant fight on their hands. And not to mention all of the volunteers and NATO allies that would start to come into the fray. Um, and again, I could be entirely wrong, but it just seems like the odds would be stacked against Russia if they did try to invade swiftly. It would not be swift. It would be bloody and costly for them. But,
Yeah.
With that being said, NATO groups managed or continue to manage to cross many of what Russia calls like red lines, like staging additional troops, sending additional weapons, flying drones over Russian airspace, things of that nature. And so we're on the precipice here, and it seems like while Russia is perhaps weighing its options more carefully, the West continues to put more troops on the ground. It's like we kind of almost gaslit Russia. It's like, I don't know. I could be wrong. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's possible that Putin hasn't really reached a decision yet, and they have like multiple different kind of like stories surrounding it because they're attempting to just like bring more troops in. I know though that they're sending in more like the troops they're sending in and like the equipment are more offensive gear. So I guess even if they're lying about Russia and their invasion being imminent, I definitely think that the United States is doing everything it can to like escalate the conflict so that we're involved.
Right. I don't know. It's just interesting too that France is playing the role as more of a mediator in this whole thing, whereas Macron's been on the phone at least a couple of times in the past week with Russia. The United States is just generally kind of postured at Russia, threatening severe and swift, harsh actions. It sounds more like North Korea. You know what I mean? It sounds like a rogue state kind of lashing out. I'm not picking sides here. My side is peace and human freedom. And the war, in this case, would just be absolutely devastating. We've been used to wars that we're not necessarily winning, but wars that are pretty asymmetric. So, like, in Afghanistan, for example, it's like the most advanced military technology versus people in caves. And, it was an example of why guerrilla warfare is superior, in my opinion. Because obviously, we all know the results of Afghanistan, but we're used to being able to very much, like, control and, like, monitor the entire battlefield at all times and, sort of micromanage things. Like, Russia is a nuclear powered, like, it's a nuclear state, and it's better armed in terms of its arsenal than a lot of European nations, and certainly more than the United States. And so, Putin actually had a speech the other week basically saying, like, nobody wins in this, He's not giving off the traditional sort of, like, what you'd think like a tyrant would normally say, right? A tyrant would be like, they'd seemingly be more aggressive in their language, whereas Putin has been more like, look, no one's going to win from this. We all have nukes now. Like, this is not worth it, right? And that was in reference to the potential for the NATO, or for Ukraine to join NATO and then NATO to take back Crimea. That was his sort of, he built up towards that rhetoric. And so just the fact that that's even, on the table, the interesting observation that we have not tried diplomacy here, and instead we've continued to saber rattle. We've continued to station troops and arms, and mind you, airborne battalions. These are not defensive troops. These are troops that could be readily deployed within 72 hours. It's just alarming, and quite frankly, like, it's stupid. We're not facing off with a obscure Middle Eastern nation. This is every Call of Duty game, every psyop-y kind of movie about evil Russia, like this is it. This is perhaps it's well, it's not perhaps it's obvious that Russophobia has been growing, um, over the years, not just with RussiaGate and all of that, but before that, just
Yeah.
you know, when Russia took over Georgia and parts of Ukraine, especially. But yeah, I mean, there will be no winners in this conflict, and Russia's not even gonna. It's not like Russia's gonna take over Ukraine. Like I don't think that's, and I could be dead wrong, but it's gonna be incredibly difficult for them to do that. Their military hasn't had the experience, and Ukraine has a history back to like Nestor Makhno and the anarcho-communists then, of very successful insurgency movements. Like those people have it in their blood to sort of fight with very little but be very effective in revolutionary style tactics. So it's just not going to be good, you know. And that's if, you know, that's barring the case that, Russia does come in and a lot of Ukrainians are like, yeah, we're sort of like artificially created by the West. We actually are kind of Russia still, which is very controversial to say. But perhaps, especially in eastern parts of Ukraine where you have the Donetsk People's Republic, which is a breakaway autonomous region from Ukraine and the rest of the world, mildly are Russian influenced as well. They at least, the language they identify as Russian. And a lot of ethnicities, or a lot of people there identify their first ethnicity as Russian. Perhaps they're an indication of where that line is in the country in terms of folks that would be more willing to accept a Russian takeover, if you will. I have lots of thoughts on this. I don't think many of them are exactly right, but I think enough of them are correct. And, again, generally I just want a peaceful situation here. Diplomacy to step up. I mean, we have a really large State Department. We have so many people on that payroll, and, nothing seems to be happening. I think really the only actions that are happening that are maybe drumming Russia on for war, we've encouraged we've pretty much demanded all U.S. citizens evacuate. We're evacuating our diplomats. We are evacuating people into Poland. Britain actually pulled out all of its troops from Ukraine. Let's see. And yet, areas in eastern Ukraine, those ambassadors refuse to evacuate. I think, I don't know. Kind of rambling here, but there's just a lot to think about here because this is not a joke, and it just seems like still there's very little libertarian chatter over this whole thing, and this is probably one of the biggest, events since World War II. Except now that most countries are armed with nukes, and there's still like very little like left anti-war or right anti-war chatter over this. It's similar to what happened with the COVID passports. There was only like one or two really strong libertarian voices out there as the passports were being rolled out, or even the lockdowns. It's like, I don't know. It seems as though as a movement we sometimes get like, we freeze, right? We look at things and it's like, oh my God, it's just like Mises said. Whoa! And it's like, yes, dude, like it's happening. And then we just kind of get steamrolled by whatever policy comes through. Like we know we have the intellectual firepower and the great, talking points to fight back against things like empire building, inflation, which we're going through, and yet we freeze up. And so, not only just for the survival of human freedom, but the survival of humanity, I think it's really important that we step up in this case.
Yeah, I think that, we should definitely oppose any form of conflict. I guess my concern at this point is just that it just seems like the level of like posturing that the United States is engaging in at this point, like I don't know exactly how you can like turn the ship around unless you had like a mass popular upheaval against it, and like people are they're just like worried about like 100 other things right now. They're worried about like the COVID mandates and the lockdowns. They're worried about Joe Rogan trying to get kicked off of
Oh yeah.
Spotify. Um, Team Rogan. So anyway, I don't know. It's just like there's like a lot of like issues going on all at the same time, and even though this one at this point I would say probably should take more precedence. I mean, not that the other issues aren't important as well. I think that, I mean, but the lockdowns I think are on their way out. Um, I think the elites have actually like lost on this one for the most part. Um, and the whole Joe Rogan thing. I mean, Joe Rogan can just move to just dude, just get like a fucking BitChute and like a Rumble and like an Odyssey and like all that stuff. Tell Spotify to fuck itself and bring like bring the masses over to those alternative make make the big tech giants suffer. And so if he does that, then that's all solved. But this one, I think that in order to prevent it, you would need a very quick upswelling of like a lot of people, and that's sort of why it is more pressing, because the other two, like, you could solve. Um, well, one is already being solved. Another one you could solve pretty easily, I think.
Right.
Um, so yeah, it just worries me a lot because I don't. It just seems like it's going to happen, and maybe. Um, I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, hypothetically, there's still like avenues for peace, but just the way the United States is like saber rattling at this point, NATO and allies, they're acting like they're the super friends, and that they're like a unified force against, um, like like one dictator who runs like a shitty like second world economy. Like what? It just seems like, I don't know. It just seems like the. I don't really know if we'll be able to like just talk our way out of this one at this point. Like, just because I don't think the United States wants to. I think that Joe Biden is so uh, fucked in the polls. I think that the economy is so bad. I think that Biden is such a controlled puppet that there's no real incentive. Like, I think that they're just trying. I just think they're gunning for it.
Okay, yeah, so there's larger forces afoot. It just seems, yeah. Maybe I'm just an optimist, but there's a few indications that, suggest we're not quite at invasion just yet. I mean, the Kremlin on the phone with the United States, or Putin rather. I'm just looking at this here. Looks like the two leaders agree to continue dialogue, whatever that means. But again, on the flip side, all the people monitoring ceasefire violations in eastern Ukraine are now gone and evacuated, so there could be some kind of trouble stirred up with the separatists and Ukrainian forces that could potentially escalate now. It's hard to tell, but they've been gunning up. They've been building anti-Russian sentiment for decades now, and I believe it's coming to a head. I mean, you see people online making like very good points about how well we surround Russia with military bases and allies, and they're denounced as Russian bots and trolls. So what people thought was securing democracy and election integrity back in like 2017 when they were calling people Russian bots is now going to culminate into our military wing getting us into a potential nuclear war, which I really hope it was worth it. You know, the 2 impeachment trials that were highly successful. I hope that was worth it. And that's kind of my final thought here. I hope it was worth it. I hope you feel good about voting for Joe Biden. I hope that as the military state expands, you enjoy.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, most of them are just too, like, they're just too dumb, and they're not gonna, like, notice how bad everything is until it's, like, right there, and they're also probably not gonna connect the dots that it was the anti-Russia, like, propaganda
Right.
that came in, you know, especially 2016 and throughout the Trump presidency, but they were ginning it up before as well, for sure. And like, I just, at this point, like, a lot of people, especially on like the sort of progressive, like BuzzFeed style left, they don't really have, I don't think they have like enough like self-reflection to like admit that the anti-Russian propaganda was like a major force that is causing this. I mean, I think that a lot of them are going to still be skeptical of war just because war, like, I mean, for them at least, it's like, just like war is scary or something. But, um, I don't think they're going to, I don't think that they're actually going to admit fault in some form of guilt, that and admit the role that they, um, the role that they played to get us here in the first place.
Well, I think an even more terrifying possibility is that we start to see these apparatuses, you know, the fact checking, the account deplatforming, things like that, used against people who are critical of NATO and the, you know, Western Bloc.
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, based on how these folks behaved during coronavirus and the lockdowns, um, you know, not only are they not going to feel any kind of remorse or you're kind of reflecting, but they're going to double down likely. And you're going to have left wingers openly supporting the military apparatus through calls for banning and deplatforming, which is just full circle.
Well, I mean, if that starts happening, then, um, I mean, I've been thinking the left they've been total sellouts for the past, like, 5 or 6 years at least. Um, but if that happens, I, I don't know. that would that would be like a whole new level of sellout. We'd have to come up with a new term for how pathetic that would be. uh, but I, but I'm not. I wouldn't even be really shocked, unfortunately.
Mhm. I think it's a good long-term place to leave off on. In the short term, we really need to start organizing against this, like now, yesterday, 4 weeks ago.
Yeah.
You know, but on that note,
Um, Viva la revolution.